if I'm a detective and atheist Michael Shermer is a detective and we come on a dead body.
That's a really fucking weird thing to say. God damn it. Like that sounds like some serial killer psychopath shit. What? Oh, no. Oh, my bad. Took that completely the wrong way. Woo! Shit. Anyways, that's a really weird thing to say that both you and Michael Shermer stumble upon a dead body. I know that he's setting up some kind of scenario here to give, I guess, an analogy for what he's thinking about, but still, it's kind of a weird thing to say. I think he's been talking to J. Warner Wallace a little bit too much for this particular short.
And I say, okay, I'm looking at all the evidence here. I think candidate X did it. And Michael Shermer says, no, candidate X did it. Or didn't do it. That's the wrong, he's not the murderer. And I say, okay, who is the murderer then? And he says, well, I just lack a belief that your guy's the murderer.
So, first of all, I feel like if this were an actual crime scene in which Frank Turek and Michael Shermer, which I have to say, that's gotta be like a comedic duo to put in some kind of like police comedy. Not like a serious cop show. Like, this is a comedy cop show because you got Frank Turek, somebody who has no detective experience whatsoever. Michael Shermer, who also has no detective experience whatsoever, are thrown into the mix of policing, and they have to figure out who done it. What the fuck would you even call that kind of cop show? Skepticops. One's a skeptic, one's a believer in God. Who will you believe? So I feel like that's the really wrong question to ask if you're in that situation, or how that situation would really play out. So you got Frank Turek, this guy's microscopes and all of his like science shit out, and he's looking at all the evidence and he's like, candidate X did it. I know he did it. And here's the evidence. And Shermer's over there like, you know what? I don't think he did. And then the next question to ask is, why do you not believe that? Like, what pieces of evidence don't seem to line up for you that points you in the direction of this candidate X over here? And then, of course, then the discussion can move forward. This is the evidence, and this is why that evidence doesn't convince me of this candidate as being the murderer. Now, that's how it should go, but in Frank Turek's mind, that's not how it goes. Because in Frank Turek's mind, he asks, well, who is the murderer? And you don't have to know who the murderer is. I mean, the evidence to point to in the direction towards the actual murderer may not even be there. Maybe it's a knife that you find stashed away 3 blocks down or something like that. Like, it could be anything, but just because you're not convinced the evidence points in one direction doesn't mean that you have to come up with an alternative direction for the evidence to point to. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you won't have that. Just saying that it's not required in order to refute why this candidate is not the murderer. That's not how it works in Frank's head, though, because he's like, well, who is the murderer? And of course, in his mind, Shermer's like, well, I just like a belief that he is a murderer. And that's also not how detective work would go or how this conversation would go. Because I believe that anybody that is a reasonable person would be like, well, here are the reasons why I don't believe that guy is the murderer. Of course, Frank Turek is trying to put this in the context of atheists saying that I just lack a belief in God. And we have to come up with some kind of alternative explanation for things when we really don't. He's saying, well, I lack a belief in this. And I mean, lack of belief, don't believe. I hate the lack of belief like phrasing there because I feel like it leaves you open to a lot of issues. I just don't believe that guy's a murderer. And you can explain why you don't believe that. Just like in the God discussion, I can explain to you why I don't believe that Yahweh exists. I can tell you why I think the evidence does not support your conclusion that the Abrahamic God exists. I can explain this to you, and I do that all the time. So it's not just like I lack a belief in this. I'm saying that I don't believe in your conclusion, and that's it. I don't have to come up with an alternative explanation for anything. If your evidence doesn't support your conclusion, then that's all that I need to say that your conclusion doesn't make sense. Fucking dumbass.
Is he a good detective? No.
I feel like yes, he is. Because if the evidence doesn't support the conclusion that candidate X is the murderer, then somebody should say that. That's how innocent people get thrown in jail. That's why the Innocence Project exists. Like, are you fucking, like, is he a good detective? Yes, he's a good detective because he's been able to suss out that your conclusion is shit. Now, does that mean that he won't come up with an alternative person, like another candidate, in order to, catch the murderer? No, it doesn't say that he's not going to do that. It just says that your conclusion's shit there, Frank.
Shooting down my suspect isn't enough.
Yes, it is. Shooting down the idea that God exists, the Abrahamic God exists, or anything like that is good enough. Just because your God doesn't exist doesn't mean that a God doesn't exist. But what we're saying is that your God doesn't exist, and we don't believe that any God exists. And we don't have to come up with alternative explanations for anything in order to be justified in not believing in your God, or any God for that matter.
If he's a good detective, he has to give reasons as to why candidate Y is the murderer.
Right, and he will give reasons when he presents candidate Y. But maybe he doesn't have any reasons just yet. He just knows that your reasoning for candidate X is bullshit. And that's all he has to have in order to reject your candidate X. Seriously, Frank, do you not know how this shit works? Because I feel like your whole logical reasoning, like compass or what the fuck ever you have, is just on the fritz. Maybe it's been on the fritz your entire life, but you're fucked up, bro.
Not just to say that your guy is the wrong guy. That's all I'm saying, Scott.
Well, Scott, I hope that you understand how much of a dipshit Frank is, okay? Because we don't have to come up with any alternative explanations for anything to not believe in his God or any God whatsoever.